Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 7th of October 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. Of course, with me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to say we're going to be joined by two guests today. We'll have David Scott from Northern Exposure, north of the border, of course. And we're also going to be joined again by Dave Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. And David will be bringing us an update to his report on what's happening with the British military and matters to do with the creation of EU forces. And of course, David has recently appeared on Russia Today, talking about the situation in Syria. So weather, well, unfortunately, we have to say the sunshine seems to have disappeared here in Plymouth. It's gone very chilly, grey, cold, drizzly. And we've got very few reports of weather from the rest of the country, so we're probably going to guess that it's gloomy elsewhere. Where are we going to start, Mike?
Well, we are, of course, starting with the white helmets. So here we are, Independent. The media coverage of this, the media hype over the last number of days regarding the white helmets and the Nobel Peace Prize just has been getting unbelievable. This is typical of it. Who will win the Nobel Peace Prize? We don't know, but there are some possibilities. Well, of course, we do know now, but we'll come on to that in a second. But the prize has to go to the Telegraph, who in their news section had this headline: the Nobel Peace Prize must go to the White Helmets or else endorse the murderous peace of Putin. A spectacular headline. This wasn't branded as an opinion piece in the Telegraph. It was under the news section, although it is an opinion piece. Now, nonetheless, the Peace Prize has gone to Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia. Now, of course, this is a bit ironic in a sense as well, because the so-called Colombian peace is more to do with drugs than anything else. But at least it didn't go to the White Helmets. And I think, Brian, we've got to say that this, bearing in mind, and I say this because of the media coverage and just the hype in the media over the last week or two, this has got to be seen as a victory for Vanessa Beeley and everybody that has taken up her call to argue against the White Helmets getting this prize.
Well, I think that's absolutely the case, Mike. It was only the reporting by Vanessa, and of course you followed that through on the UK column, that has put this whole subject to the White Helmet into the public arena. We're now seeing, of course, Russia Today is picking up on that. But what amazing rhetoric from the Telegraph, that this murderous piece, all blamed on the Russians, of course, nothing to do with the aggressive action of the United Kingdom, USA, in all of those countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and of course trouble in the Yemen. We're beginning to see the media, whether it's press or TV in UK, totally exposed, Mike. They're using the type of language that previously we would have pointed a finger at Pravda and said, well, this is straight out of the Eastern Bloc, this is communist propaganda. We're now seeing that propaganda come out of studios in UK and off-print presses in UK.
Absolutely. So good to see the Nobel Committee had a bit of sense this time. They unfortunately didn't have sense when they gave it to Barack Obama, because he has become the most warlike US president since the United States was established. So that was an unfortunate decision. They still haven't revoked that decision, despite the calls for them to do so. But at least this time they've made a relatively sensible decision. Right. David Scott, let's have a talk about stuff going on north of the border and named person scheme. And you sent me down this leaflet that somebody had been given from NHS Tayside, sharing information about children and young people.
Yes, this was handed to people going into A&E. So if you had a child who had fallen over and was injured, everyone going into an accident and emergency with a child was given this, and it states that your details and those of your child may be disclosed to other professionals, for example, so not an exclusive list, school nurse, health visitor, social worker and GP. This follows the guidance from the Scottish Government, so that's where it's coming from. The purpose of this is to ensure that children receive the services they require presumably in the interest of the state, because it's not the services that you request. And this has all been done in the best interest of the child or young person.
So David, when was the most recent? When was this handed out most recently? Then
it was about a month ago.
Right.
Just about 6 weeks ago. Although perhaps more recently than that, but we got it about 6 weeks ago, and it was then questioned as to how this sits in the light of the finding from the Supreme Court.
Right. So we have a letter from Leslie Scott here to the NHS and the reply.
Yes, this points out that the reason given for the breach of the Data Protection Act 1998 is when in the best interest of the child, not crucially when it is considered that there's a risk of significant harm. So this refers to the fact that the information sharing threshold was lowered dramatically by the Scottish Government in preparation for the rollout of the named person scheme. And then that lowering of the information sharing threshold was found to be unlawful and out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament. So this was pointed out, and there was a long pause. But to their credit, to actually their great credit, the NHS came back with, and I'm going to shock people here, a correct response. It reads, your correspondence and recommendation has enabled the opportunity to reflect on current processes and procedures in the important area of information sharing, which the NHS Tayside takes extremely seriously. I wish to confirm that action has been taken to withdraw the leaflet from distribution and to carefully reconsider NHS Tayside information governance procedures in the area of and in this area, the Child Nurse and Families NHS Tayside is facilitating the change in practice. With staff of a child protection concern in such instances, NHS Tayside's existing child protection policies and procedures will continue to operate. So what you have there is a member of the public pointed out that this is unlawful, and NHS Tayside in fact withdrew the leaflet and completely changed the policies, and it's a very rare thing, did the right thing. If only the Scottish Government as a whole would actually use that sort of approach rather than the wall-to-wall lying and denying of real issues that we have to tolerate daily.
David, that is a remarkable result, and congratulations to all of the team north of the border who've been pushing on the named person scheme. What it shows, though, is the lengths to which the Scottish Government at least will go to in order to build up this huge database on everybody using the issue of children and education and, of course, the NHS. And I'd just like to add that I recently had a conversation with a person who'd gone for a consultation at an NHS hospital because they were having problems hearing, or they suspected that they were having problems hearing. The hospital couldn't find anything physical, and very quickly the discussion turned to the fact, well, if your mind is very busy, sometimes you don't hear things that are said to you. Is your mind very busy? To which the person said, well, certainly is, because I'm working hard to assist people who are finding out untoward things in the care industry. And that then turned into a discussion on the state of their mind, and that in turn came to well-being, and would you like to look out the window and tell us what you can see? And as this person was describing these events, I'm thinking to myself, and yes, and all this is now going on your medical records with the drift towards the fact that possibly this person has got some form of mental illness. So this connectivity across all of these agencies, education, NHS, the police, mental health, this is a very, very dangerous collection of data on individuals, particularly when we know that the parties in power seem to be hostile. Is this aspect of it that we've got a framework being built? Is this coming to light alongside the named person scheme?
there seems to be a constant attempt to build up databases in Scotland, and the most common avenue is to use the NHS database as a starting point and then distribute that to all other arms of the state. The reason for this is that the NHS is where people feel safest. They feel least threatened. If you were to start with tax authorities or police, people would be on the defensive. But because it's the NHS, something that most people view very positively, they are rather put to sleep on this. So they're trying to assemble a database, a national ID card, show me your papers, etc., based on the NHS as a core. And the other thing we have to remember is that there's always an attempt by the psychiatric profession to make themselves central to everything, so that your entire life will be under some form of psychiatric care or psychiatric assessment. And this, as we know, dates right the way back to the 1940s, where they were planning to gain for themselves a controlling interest in all the other professions.
Indeed.
Okay, David, we'll move on. Before we start, though, tell us who is Pete Wishart?
Pete Wishart is allegedly my MP. I say allegedly because I'm less able to communicate with him now because he doesn't really answer emails anymore, and he's blocked me on Twitter for having unapproved thoughts. I'm afraid I need re-education, it would seem.
Right, sorry. You need re-education when he's tweeting out something like this, and his tweet says, the Blairouts are now like your embarrassing, incontinent old relatives stuck away in a care home who you might go on and visit occasionally. What kind of mind produces a tweet like that?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, it's the sort of mind who has a controlling interest in how we run our health service and state care for the elderly, which does not bode well if you are either elderly or planning to become elderly. Mr. Wishart is a very prolific tweeter, although I'm no longer able to see his output. I'm quite grateful for that. But a lot of it is of this sort of type. He did, however, excel himself in the subject of Brexit, something which causes him some form of mental illness, I think, because he becomes very animated on the subject of Brexit. And here he is, and what he's done is he's likened it to the famous quote, first they came for the Jews, and I did not object, for I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, etc., which was a minister, Protestant Christian minister in Nazi Germany. So he's likened this, the situation in Brexit Britain, post-Brexit Britain, to Nazi Germany. Now, I would have to point out that the SNP MSPs and MPs have a terrible track record on this, and some of the more extreme members of the party do as well. During the independence referendum here, the letter Q was spray painted on doors of things like the Conservative Party HQ in Aberdeen, Q standing for Quisling. So they're very prone to use Nazi imagery. Now, this is extremely unwise for a nationalist socialist party. And one with such totalitarian tendencies as the SNP constantly display. And I can really only suggest that what's on display here is the fact that social justice warriors always project. So their innermost secrets are the ones that they will project onto others. So when Mr. Wishart starts pointing the finger at people and calling them Nazis, what he's really admitting is deep down he is totalitarian and he has those tendencies himself.
Well, we'll stick with UK politics well, frankly, the desperation among some appears to be reaching the surface because the news broke today that Tony Blair is leaving the door open to come back to UK politics. So I've labelled this "Here I Come, Ready or Not." They're basically, this seems to be a reaction to Jeremy Corbyn. They're getting so desperate about what's happening with the Labour Party at the moment that they're even considering bringing the most hated politician in the country, probably in history, back into mainstream politics. I mean, David, what are your thoughts on this?
It's unbelievable that he should think that this is possible. Can you imagine the hustings? Can you imagine the protests? can you imagine the objections to him? In fact, he would most likely be getting arrested quite a lot. There'd be people wanting to make citizens arrest. The security would need to be enormous. But can you imagine the protests if he tried to re-enter British politics? He would be hounded out. It's fantasy to believe. It shows how disconnected he is that he believes that that's a possibility.
But of course, it's not just him that's disconnected, because he's not the only person. I mean, there are people behind him demanding that he comes back to deal with this mess in the Labour Party. So it's clearly not just him that's thinking this way.
Yeah, but the problems in the Labour Party go much deeper, because the Labour Party, like all socialist parties, is a split between the city-based elite who have one set of ideas and the ordinary working class people on whose votes they depend, who have quite another set of ideas. And what's being displayed here is that those are ultimately incompatible, and Blair is not the solution to that.
Indeed.
It is desperation, but of course, if your plan is to make sure the Labour Party is utterly destroyed, leaving a dictatorship under Theresa May, then promoting a Blair comeback makes complete sense. Sorry to be a pessimist.
No, well, let's move back north of the border then, before we move on. Parents slate jargon-laden consultation over schools. This is Mr. Swinney again. And we're about to show a particularly fetching picture of him, but give us a bit of background to this one.
Yes, well, Mr. Swinney has put out a consultation for schools, and it is written in government newspeak. We have, let me see if I can just get the right article here. While I'm looking for this, actually, could you put the other David on? I think he wants to say something about Mr. Blair. I saw him looking like he was going to explode there.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, it's obvious. Of course, you know, he's got a proven track record of starting very large illegal wars out in the east. So, of course, they don't want to start another one in Syria, do they? Wouldn't be anything to do with that, would it?
That's extremely cynical, Mr. Ellis, if I may say so. A scurrilous suggestion that Tony Blair would want to help kickstart Syria properly, but I think you might be very close to the truth on that. We'll be talking Syria in a minute. So, David, have you found your papers?
Yes, thanks to the other David for covering for me there. Yes, there's some of the questions that Mr. Swinney is asking the Scottish people.
There's too many Davids, if I may say so.
You can't have too many Davids. It's
absolutely.
They ask, what are the barriers within the current governance arrangements to achieving the vision of excellence and equity for all? How can effective collaboration amongst teachers and practitioners be further encouraged and incentivised? How should government support teacher education and professional learning in order to build the professional capacity we need? So what we see here is a strange form of newspeak, a strange form of Scottish government newspeak, where we have to say only positive things, everything is wonderful, and we have to introduce the idea that it could be even better. We're trying to suggest that there are problems without admitting that there are problems. And it makes the language completely opaque management nonsense. It's everything that's worst in management consultancy in a government.
Yeah. Well. I mean, we got to put this image on screen, and you've got to justify it, I think.
Well, on Twitter, I'm suggesting that I'm finding it increasingly hard to tell these two images apart. I can still just about manage the one on the left is Mr. Swinney. Now, the reason I did this is Mr. Swinney, when was faced with the Supreme Court saying that his act was completely unlawful, and he came on to say, well, it's just a minor tweak, we're going to carry on. And I did comment it was like being governed by the Terminator, because he will not stop. He will keep going forever. He will remove your rights. He will destroy your rights. And he will never, never stop unless, I suppose, he's crushed in a giant vice in a dramatic final scene in a factory.
Okay. Super. Right. Let's get on to more serious subjects then. This article appeared in the Telegraph today. Sir Cliff Richard sues the BBC and the police after raid of his house was broadcast live on TV. The article says Sir Cliff Richard, the singer, is suing the BBC and South Yorkshire Police after a raid on his home was filmed from a helicopter and shown live on TV. Sir Cliff was the subject of a long-running South Yorkshire Police investigation which centred on accusations dating between 1958 and 1983 made by 4 men. Officers investigating allegations of historic sex offences were filmed searching his apartment in Berkshire in 2014, leading him to being publicly named as the subject of the probe. And what I've labelled this graphic here is Operation Or Part 2, because whoever made the decision within the BBC, setting aside what Cliff Richard was alleged to have done, what the BBC have done here is to deliberately sabotage a police investigation. To my mind, if the BBC wants to comment on this, they're welcome to. But this reminded me very much of the type of sabotage that we saw with Operation Or, where people that were clearly innocent were deliberately targeted and brought to trial, effectively, with a view of discrediting the whole operation and the whole investigation. So, to my mind, this is the BBC at work helping to shut down the investigation into historic child sexual abuse.
Yeah, well, Mike, this is a fascinating subject, but by pure coincidence, yesterday I had a very good conversation with Tony Farrell, former intelligence officer from South Yorkshire Police, and he was talking within our conversation about this subject. How was it that information about this raid was leaked from the police? It was deliberate, it was malicious. And then our discussion got on to the fact that it's now becoming well reported that within minority communities across the country, Asian Muslim communities, where those people are reporting child abuse within their communities, the police are not taking any action. Indeed, social services are not taking any action. What happens is the names of the individuals who are reporting the abuse, those names are leaked back into the community. And as a result, those individuals have suffered severe harassment. We are told that some women have been raped for the act of reporting what is happening to the authorities. And children who are suffering abuse are then suffering worse abuse. So the police are not just sitting by and doing nothing. The police are helping leaks back into these communities where people are coming forward to report the abuse. And then, as you say, we've got this amazing situation where the BBC runs this incredible publicity piece on the operation around Cliff Richard's home. And this is now, of course, being used to say, well, we can't have the spotlight on those in high-profile positions who've been accused of child abuse. This is an operation.
And we should also perhaps mention or remind people that there is a series running on television. I can't remember what channel it's on, whether it's the BBC or ITV, starring Robbie Coltrane. Can't remember its name. But basically, the premise of it is to sort of highlight what happens to a celebrity when they're incorrectly identified as or charged with having carried out these kinds of offences. So there is huge propaganda going on within the mainstream media at the moment on this issue. Indeed,
and some extraordinary connections between the police and the media, which is causing these problems. And I'll just add that reports that UK Column has been received from some very interesting people talking about a deliberate blind eye from the police to crime, including gun crime, including drugs. But those sources are also saying to us, well, never mind the guns and the drugs, everything leads back to the abuse of children by people in extremely powerful positions. Just before we mentioned Melanie Shaw, David, would you like just to have a quick comment? David Scott, we better make it plain. Would you like to have a comment on this concept that the police are involved in the trafficking and abuse of children?
It's what we're seeing in Scotland. We have a situation where the largest charity dealing with survivors is saying to people who want to report abuse or want to escape abuse, escape. Get yourself safe, get your children safe. Don't report the matter to the authorities. Because if you report the matter to the authorities, the first thing that happens is your children will be seized by social services. The second thing that happens is that they will be put into the custody of one of the people that you have named as an abuser. That's the pattern they see. They've seen it over and over and over again. There is no explanation other than the most craven corruption for why that pattern should exist. So it's one of the most dangerous things you can do in this country is to appeal to the authorities for help.
Right, what a state of affairs, and let's really emphasise that by saying that we understand today is Melanie Shaw's birthday. So Melanie Shaw, the extremely brave lady that blew the whistle on child abuse at Beechwood Children's Home, Nottingham. Now, of course, Melanie is no longer in HM Prison Peterborough after a short period of freedom. She's now banged up in Foston Hall Prison in Derby. We do not know whether she's on remand or has been charged and convicted and is now serving some form of sentence. We absolutely don't know that. What we can say is that she is again being denied her long-term medication, which she has needed to cope with the trauma of the abuse she suffered as a child. So no medication, and we understand that some of the staff in this prison are particularly brutal. And we're also going to say, let us remember that what has happened to Melanie Shaw is exactly what you've spoken about, David, that once she had spoken out, and particularly when she'd identified that Nottinghamshire police were lying when they said that they had conducted interviews with certain people. That was untrue because the people had already been dead for some 3 months. Once Melanie spoke out about the deliberate failure of the police to investigate, her own son was taken from her by Nottingham Social Services, and we now understand the treatment of that child is less than satisfactory. So this is a very, very dangerous agenda in this country.
Just before we move on from that, Brian, I just want to mention that we unfortunately have had quite a number of free Melanie Shaw t-shirts left over from the first time that she was in prison. So we've got those out again. We're selling them at cost price. We're not wanting to make any money off this. But we would just encourage anybody that feels like it to get hold of one and start getting the word out on Melanie Shaw and what's going on with her.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right, well, we're moving on to the subject of the military and the formation of the EU military. There is no question that this is happening, and this is part of the background to the ramping up of violence by Theresa May and Obama in Syria. But let's have a look at what's happening. And this was an article which several people highlighted. So the Daily Mail, with this classic picture, first for the army, a soldier weds his groom on base. Air Vice Marshal does the honours as gay couple tie the knot in Cyprus. Now, this is really extraordinary stuff for a number of reasons. But first of all, let's have a look at the Air Vice Marshal. We went to Forces TV. We've got a lot to say really on Forces TV, but we'll save that for another day. So here he is, Air Vice Marshal Mike Wigston. And he turns part-time vicar in order to marry this gay couple. Now, why are we interested in this ceremony? Well, we thought we'd get right to the heart of the matter. We are going to ask the questions that other people simply don't want to ask. So let's just go through them. The first one is, why was the commander of British forces in Cyprus conducting this wedding? Is this part of his role to conduct weddings? We'd like some answers. Does he conduct weddings for men and women under his command, or does he possibly only do it for gay couples? Can any couple be married by the Air Vice Marshal? So has he got a special list of people that he's prepared to marry, or does he say to any of the troops under his command, you want to be married, you come forward and I'm delighted to do it? If that's the case, we'd like to see where that's in his terms of reference as a senior officer, as the senior officer in Cyprus. We might ask whether there's a special relationship between the Air Vice Marshal and Sergeant Smith. I'll just point out here that Sergeant Smith is marrying a civilian partner. But is it the case that there's some form of special relationship we don't know about, which means that the Air Vice Marshal was happy to conduct this ceremony? And we'd like to ask why this event has been given so much publicity. Presumably other people under his command, men and women, have got married. That doesn't seem to have made the Daily Mail. And then we're also going to ask, will the next step be satanic weddings following the mod's approval of Satanism in the armed forces? So we're going to see some form of hand fasting coming in where the senior British officer will preside. So just remember that background, because this is one of the attacks on British armed forces at the moment. But let's bring in Michael Fallon, Mike Robinson's favourite, of course. We had this slide up a couple of days ago. He said, I want more recruits from ethnic minorities and more women. I've opened up combat roles. This isn't about tokenism, it's about talent. Well, I'll just point out to people, this is an I want. So never mind what the public wants. This is Mr. Fallon telling us how he's going to change the military into the style he thinks we want. So let's follow this through. So this is Forces TV again, and they're advertising that if you want to become the first female Royal Marines commando, you need to get on board. It talks all about the fitness tests, and it says the time, distance and weight criteria will be exactly the same for women in all 4 tests. Now, I am highly suspicious about this. And why? Because I'll come on to it just a second. Just to comment on that, if we think of the impact, what are the Russians looking at the moment? Well, apparently the toughest British troops are now women. I'll leave people to think about that. I'm not demeaning women. I'm pointing out where this is heading. But why am I suspicious about the fitness rules? Because this was the Mail article where it had exposed that army fitness tests will be rewritten to make sure female soldiers can qualify for frontline duty. So this is positive discrimination in order to get the change agenda in. And the reality of this is that as the women are brought into the armed forces, like it or not, at the moment, there's some vicious bullying going on, and women are frontline victims in that bullying for sexual favours. But in any case, sexual relations between men and women and same-sex partners is a massive attack on military discipline and morale. And I'm just going to interject at that stage and say, David Ellis, what is your take on this? This is deliberate. This is a deliberate change agenda being unleashed on the British Army at the moment.
Thank you, Brian. A complete, blatant transformation change agenda. So let's just wind the clock back slightly and look at what was the modus operandi in Her Majesty's Armed Services 40, 50 years ago. Nothing like this, nothing at all. If you'd have gone back to your father or your grandfather that served and spoke of what's happening now, they would be in disbelief, and they certainly wouldn't vote for it, and they certainly wouldn't support it. So our fathers can be our jury. So that's a good baseline for all of us to look at upon this. So about 20 or 30 years ago, we saw the government successively, regardless of party, cut, and radically in the last 15 to 10 years, where they've taken out the heart of oak of our armed services. All of the time served, hard-edged service personnel have all been made redundant, got rid of. We've then gone, right, okay, we're going to have all this rapid reaction force, or force this or force that, and a review that's engineered in the fashion that we've got now, where they're relying on reserves because there isn't enough of a standing army, all against officer advice. Yeah. So what are we changing to? And the answer is, it is absolutely apparent now. They are changing the services to go into EU military union, aka EU Army, Navy, or Air Force. So this is the agenda. So we've sold the guns short at the top end. We've got rid of all our decent assets. We're not making anything anymore because we can't. And at the other end of the agenda, we're locking guys up for doing their job out in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. And now we're bringing this in. So this isn't just a change agenda and a transformation. Frankly, what this is brand. It's a rebranding. So in order to rebrand, we've got to get rid of the old brand. All right. So we've done that by getting rid of all the old guard and all the time served sergeants and corporals and lance corporals, all the people that carry you through a battle, or the chief petty officers or whatever, or the TIFs. We've got rid of all them. There aren't none. You know, we've given them all redundancy papers, and now we're bringing this in. So this couldn't be more apparent now to the general public. So I ask you all to view it from this perspective. Would your granddad support this, or would your fathers or your mothers and grandmothers supported this? I don't believe they would.
Yeah, David, thank you for that. Right, we'll follow on through with some more examples, some of which we've shown before, but we've put them together because they emphasise one another. Where are we heading? Well, this is where we're heading. So reports after reports saying the 2020 plan was for about 82,000 regular troops, but don't worry because they're backed up by 30,000 reservists. Now, much as I can say, reserve forces can be extremely effective, and I don't doubt the dedication of the people who come forward as reservists. The hard fact is that reservists are not frontline troops. They are part-time troops. So massive cuts to 82,000 frontline men. This is not enough to sustain any form of major campaign, whether it's on our doorstep in Europe or whether it's overseas. The next thing that's happening, of course, is that we're selling off military infrastructure. And we've got the move through to the European army here. Mr. Junkers was calling for this originally. And I'm going to say at this point, we've got to go back to the UK column where we were warning of what was coming in 2011. So we sell off the structure, we reduce the size of the armed forces. The clear plan was that, as you say, it was being completely rebranded in order to move us towards the European military structure. And then you came up with the exposure on Mr. Sajid Javid, because he had started to speak at a meeting up in London where he was caught out by saying, well, we need to cut the British military in order to get us into the armed forces. Just very briefly, David, just give us 30 seconds on this.
Well, what Sajid Javid said was, and this was in a closed party fundraiser, unfortunately, there was a former head of naval intelligence there that I was acquainted with. And what he said was, aren't Britain's defence forces doing rather well? And, of course, at the time, this was rather an apparent sort of slip because Mr. Javid, you know, as far as we can see, isn't really acquainted with the armed services. So the only thing he could have been doing was reiterating from within his circle what he had overheard. Because in Britain, we don't have defence forces. That's what Japan and Germany has. There's a clue there, isn't there? Germany has defence forces. So we have armed services. It's a very different affair. And of course, the commander there that was former naval intelligence went absolutely berserk and showed the guy the door because he was so incensed at what he said because of his terms of reference. But I believe there was fundamentally something there much deeper than that because he was already being groomed for cabinet at the time, clearly.
Right.
And he had clearly overheard within that inner sanctum circle the references to defence forces, which is what Germany has.
And reduced numbers. So let's lead on through John Redwood's diary, and you'd picked up on this one. So John Redwood saying that he found Sir Michael's statement that he would continue to veto a European army all the time the UK remains in the EU perplexing. Now we are leaving. I do not see it's any business of ours to veto what they are going to do when we leave. And he went on to say this, nor do I understand how Sir Michael can veto something that already exists. And the UK has accepted the EU has established 18 battle groups, each of battalion strength, with a rota so that any two of them can be deployed. So John Redwood here clearly saying that basically, he's saying we're coming out of the EU, but we've accepted the fact that we are going to continue to be linked in with the military. You picked up on this one. This is clear. Once you start to put the pieces of the jigsaw together, we can see the move to the EU military. Anything you can add on these comments from Redwood?
Well, it's a self-fulfilling revelation there from Redwood, isn't it? Because he's just told everyone exactly what the score is. Oh, we're in. We're way in. Of course, there was no plans, was there? We'd been told by the Prime Minister David Cameron there were no plans. Well, of course there was plans. All this sort of stuff doesn't happen over 5 minutes. This takes a lot of time to organise. So, this is just, we've got on the one hand a tiny group that are very aware and very complicit, clearly, with some of them, and then we've got the other majority of the party. And I'll give you an example. I just met Mark Pawsey, the member for Rugby, this morning. And he said, well, we're doing really well at the moment because we've left the EU and, and we've Brexited and all this and all. Don't worry about no understanding of the military union component whatsoever. I said, well, hang on a minute, Mark. Sorry, you said we'd Brexited and we left. We haven't. Nothing's happened. Now, what this says to me, and I could, with all of the other Tory MPs that I've met, I can say without any reservation, equivocation, or mental reservation of any kind, that they are rendered inept within the confines of the party that they serve, not the people. They serve the party, and they cannot. Thereby, they are locked out of the representation of the people to which they purport. It's as simple as that.
Okay, well, now there's been plenty of media coverage, though, on what John Redwood was referring to, because this is an example. EU Observer here saying UK to veto EU defence union. So, you, David, and we at the column and other people have been saying EU defence union is absolutely a reality. It's happening now. But in the meantime, UK government spokespeople continue to insist that there's no such thing and that they will veto it given the opportunity. So let's just have a look at what Michael Fallon was doing yesterday. Well, he was meeting his German counterpart. This was the 26 years since the reunification of Germany, and he thought he would celebrate that by going over and meeting his counterpart in Germany. And he was speaking alongside her, and he said that the UK and Germany were committed to tackling threats around the world. He said that the Royal Navy's newest helicopter will soon be flying from a German warship because there's no European military union at all going on. But we're flying each other's equipment and so on. He said that Britain and Germany are turning up the volume on their partnership. Well, we don't have a partnership because there's a veto. So we don't have a partnership, but we're turning up the volume on it. And he said that last year, the Strategic Defence and Security Review lifted Germany to top-tier status, something formerly only afforded to the US and France. And he went on to say that Britain stands together with Germany to face the same challenges, including from the threat from Daesh, and shares the same values of liberty, tolerance and justice. But this was the key point that he made that I really wanted to tackle with you, David, because he said that the UK wishes to enhance rather than duplicate NATO structures. So what he is saying there, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what he is saying there is that this agreement with Germany, this new relationship with Germany, this new cooperation with Germany is not being done under the auspices of the NATO structure. And so then you're left to ask, what structure is it being done under? The only other structure that it could possibly be being done under is the EU.
Totally correct. Absolutely correct. This is blatantly apparent. Let's look at the last fortnight's media chatter. We've had Sir Fallon and May running around a fortnight ago, visiting bases, cozying up to officers, cozying up to tanks, desperate to get their credibility back with the military and the old guard that are speaking out. So we've had that, and then 5 minutes later, Fallon's over there essentially signing us up to, and they're calling it Defence Union now, but they've changed. So there's a little bit of a rebranding there. Perhaps they've got a bit ginger with the military union because we've aired it. So they're calling it Defence Union. This is it. This is the real deal. This is exactly what they're doing. This will be EU defence union, if they're going to call it that now, but I'm going to stick to my guns. It's military union. So they'll have budgetary control. All the cardinal values will come under Brussels. We will lose control with this arrangement. Over them saying Brexit means Brexit, it doesn't, because all the while they have the key factor of control of budgets and military. We're no longer a state, we're a vassal. So this is completely and utterly inverted nonsense from Fallon. And, I'm reassured by the hard edge of this, by him ordering French steel for those submarines that we've just put on the books. Is so cynical, because they've allowed Tata to strip out and stop producing British steel, in effect. And then they delay the orders for the boats. They shut the plant down there. And then 5 minutes later, we've announced that we're buying French steel. That in itself is EU industrial military union policy in the flesh.
David, it's also treason. Thank you for that. It's also treason. Just very quickly, for anybody who's getting concerned about what to do, we're just going to keep saying to people, you need to team up. So find other people to talk to. And a good place is a chat in a pub. Keep it light-hearted, but actually follow through. And we're also just reminding you that we are looking for people in these areas who are interested in teaming up, particularly with the British Constitution Group networks. And the 19th of November, of course, we've got our major event in Winchester.
Yes. Sorry, David, Scott, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, just a suggestion that people who might want to look at how we've been this route before should read this book, which is called Lord Milner's Second War by John Cafferty. Now, this details how secret agreements with the French not only took us into the First World War, but helped bring about the First World War by changing the calculations made by the other participants. And the key thing for me is the British people didn't know, the British Parliament didn't know, and the British Cabinet didn't know. It was a small clique within government and within the military who were setting up these arrangements, and the rest of the British nation were kept in the dark. But of course, it was the rest of the British nation who had subsequently to pay the price in blood.
Yes. Well, let's talk about paying the price in blood, because at the heart of that, of course, is the financial system. And David, the pound apparently suffered a bit today. We've only got a few minutes, so we got to make this brief. As a result of a flash crash on the Asian markets. Well, we can talk about the flash crash because, of course, that's, even the mainstream media is now having to discuss algorithmic trading and how this kind of thing can happen. But what are your thoughts on the general situation?
The mainstream explanation for this, it was a rogue algorithm. So there we go. It's all okay now. The general situation is the country's economy has been hollowed out over a period of about 50 years, and as a result, that's going to be reflected in reality. Sooner or later, reality has a tendency to reassert itself. Almost everything that we're being told and that's coming from commentators in the economy is false these days. We're on the PhD standard. It's not the gold standard. It's this confidence we almost have in PhD qualified economists working in central banks. These people do not know what they're doing. They have an education and background that actually leads them astray. And they are, as was discussed last week, they have painted themselves into a corner, and something very, very horrible is very close at hand.
Yes, but in fairness, quantitative easing has happened everywhere. So when it collapses, we're all going to collapse together, right?
Oh, it's worldwide, yes. But not everyone will collapse to the same extent. I mean, for example, China and Russia have been busily assembling gold reserves. And I would point out that the British government's recent record in that area, and particularly Gordon Brown's recent record in that area, is not good. What will happen is that paper assets will return to their intrinsic value of zero, and it will be real assets that will count. Real assets will be gold. Real assets will be infrastructure. real assets will be manufacturing and other productive assets that produce things that people need. It will not be fancy contracts via the City of London.
But David, I mean, you can't be right, because Christine Lagarde here is telling us that everything's fine.
Christine Lagarde has said everything's fine. She said that the reason that Brexit wasn't the complete catastrophe that the IMF had predicted was the good policy of the central banker, if you can believe that one. I would recommend everyone to watch that video. It's really very funny.
Okay.
Is this the same Christine Lagarde who's on some sort of fraud charge, or is that another lady?
No.
Yes, she's not broadcasting from a prison cell, not yet. But anyway.
Okay, well, I'm sure allegations of fraud and giving financial advice sound ideal to me. Right, well, we'll thank our guests. We'll end on the note that there's another event being put together to get good people talking to each other. That's at the Watershed, Bristol, on the 29th. So a large forum of British constitutionalists and sovereign individuals will assemble at the Watershed to hear a variety of speakers deliver presentations on issues as diverse as the rule of law, establishment corruption, and the real and present threat of societal breakdown within the context of treason. I like the sound of this, Mike. Yeah. We'll put out more on this in due course, but we wanted to give people a heads up. It comes down to the fact that we are watching treason unfold on a daily basis in UK, a total breakdown of law and order, and politicians who seem to be out of control. David, Ellis, just very quickly, you were picked up by Russia yesterday. In just 20 seconds, what were you able to get across live on RT?
Just about got the key factors as to why Syria was being expanded and exacerbated as the leverage to give birth. It's a birthing pool of the EU military union, or EU defence union, as they're now calling it, and to why that was, because they wanted budgetary control to prop up the failed euro and the mechanics of how that would then give the treasury and so on, which is what we've warned of for quite some time, here, all of us together. So we're just then talking about how the diplomatic options weren't going to work, and Washington, were clearly not going to do that, and the line got cut off. We were cut off.
Just a coincidence, David, because they sent you to the BBC.
Yeah, just a coincidence. Of course, that sort of thing happens with professional studios, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, David Ellis, David Scott, thank you very much to both of you for joining us today. And final comment is that we need the support of the public to do what we do. Are you a subscriber to UK Column? If you're not, please consider taking out a subscription. Perhaps you consider making a donation to us. We can only do what we do with the help of the public. And everything we touch at the end of the day costs money. If you like what we're doing, you want to help us grow, get out more news, and of course bring in specialist guests such as the two gentlemen we've had today, we need your financial help. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.